to get started. Our current panel is on the subject of internationalism, and I would like to introduce all of our speakers. First, we have Cabria Baumgardner, who is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She completed a certificate in feminist studies. She earned her MA in African American studies and a BA in English, cum laude from UCLA, where she was a recipient of the Gates Millennium Scholarship. Her research interests are 19th century African American history, the history of American education, comparative slavery, and 19th century American literature and culture. She's taught courses on African American history, American ethnic history, and contemporary issues in American education at UMass Amherst and at Westfield State College. And recently she was awarded a 2010-11 Spencer Foundation Dissertation Fellowship for her project on African American women educator activists in antebellum America. The next presenter is Tiffany Gil. And Tiffany Gil is an associate professor in the Department of History and is affiliated with the Warfield Center for African and African American Studies and the Center for Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. She received her PhD in American History at Rutgers and her BA in American Studies from Georgetown. Her book, Beauty Shop Politics, African American Women's Activism in the Beauty Industry, was awarded the 2010 Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Book Prize by the Association of Black Women Historians. Currently, Professor Gill is at work on a second book, manuscript, examining the birth of an African-American international tourist industry in the post-war era. Alexis Pauline Gums is our next panelist, and she's a scholar, poet, activist, and educator in the tradition of the one-room schoolhouse. Alexis received her PhD in English, African and African American Studies, and Women's Studies at Duke University. Her dissertation was entitled We Can Learn to Mother Ourselves, The Queer Survival of Black Feminism. She's published several journal articles and book chapters on this topic. Alexis is the founder of the Eternal Summer of the Black Feminist Mind, which is an intergenerational community school, lending and reference library and television show in Durham, North Carolina, and a transitional resource for creating interactive Black feminist educational space. Alexis is the co-creator of the Mobile Homecoming Project, a national experiential archive and documentary film project, amplifying generations of Black feminist LGBTQ brilliance. Our next presenter after that will be Fatma Ramdani, and she's an assistant professor in the English department at the University of Paris 13. Her research focuses on the transnationalization of women's movements in a comparative perspective. Professor Ramdani has explored feminist movements, NGOs, civil society, and international organizations, the politics surrounding health and reproductive rights. Her main area of interest is the impact of reciprocal interactions on activism and discourse. And lastly, our respondent will be Alexandra Cornelius-Diallo. Dr. Cornelius-Diallo is an assistant professor of history at Florida International University, where she specializes in African American history, race, gender, and science. She received her PhD in history from Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Cornelius-Diallo's research examines the development of racial science during the 19th century. Her book manuscript, entitled More Approximate to the Animal, African American Men and Women's Resistance to the Rise of Scientific Racism in mid-19th century America, provides a gendered analysis of the ways in which African Americans, enslaved and free, lettered and illiterate, address scientific theories of racial differences. She argues that a gendered analysis of the development of scientific racial discourse illuminates the ways in which the scientific constructions of human differences serve racist, sexist, and imperialist political agendas. And I'm the moderator for today, Natasha Lightfoot, and I teach here in the Department of History on Caribbean, Black Atlantic, African diaspora studies relating to slavery and emancipation. So please give our panelists a round of applause as they begin. First up is Cabria Baumgardner.
Okay, I hope that I won't forget to click on my presentation. If I will, so I will maybe just skip it. So now, how do I do this?
You press the button in the middle.
There you go. Oh. Okay. So this paper is based on my doctoral research in American Studies conducted at Paris 3 University. I analyzed the American stance at the 4 United Nations conferences on women organized between 1975 and 1995. I chose to focus on the role American feminist organizations played in the framing of American foreign policy and more broadly in the framing of an international human rights discourse. The first interviews I conducted with some of the key feminist actors who had attended these conferences all mentioned the crucial role played by both women of the South and American women of color. So I was puzzled because I had not read much on this influential contribution. So I decided to investigate more thoroughly Afro-American women's involvement. The analysis of primary sources I obtained after 2 research stays in the United States allowed me to better understand how Afro-American women's mobilization at the United Nations helped give a legitimate voice to women's needs and rights in the international arena. My aim here today is to show how Afro-American women used the 4 United Nations conferences on women as an additional space for activism and resistance, quote, to amplify, enhance, magnify, and give power to our voices. The United Nations conferences on women were organized within the framework of the United Nations decades, and they aimed at discussing worldwide social justice issues. As such, the agendas of these conferences echoed Afro-American women's quest for a better world. By using 3 of the historic strategies, diligent activism, recourse to insubordination or outlaw culture, racial solidarity, Afro-American women conveyed the brand of feminism and were able to develop and integrate the perspective in international innovative human rights discourse. Through the solid understanding of the public sphere and leadership capacities, Afro-American women wanted to serve as models for protest and sources of inspiration to other minority feminist movements. They were all the more determined as they considered that a unique position in the most powerful nation in the world entrusted them, quote, with a special responsibility to challenge the policy of ignoring women of color. Our unique circumstances and realities must be recognized, end of the quote. That was a prerequisite for building a better union, a better world. And I think that the most pertinent way to show how Afro-American women conceived of new ways to understand women's rights within the United Nations agenda is to take a few examples of the actions and strategies at these conferences. The first UN conference on women was held in Mexico in 1975, and it took place at a time when American supremacy was being attacked and defied by third world countries. Afro-American women's underrepresentation, both at the official and non-official gathering, pushed them to action. When the State Department organized an encounter between the official US delegation and American NGOs, they seized this opportunity to voice their anger and confront the government. African American women representing the Congress of Racial Equality attacked the USAID administrator and accused him of cooperating with the CIA. They shouted at the head of the official American delegation and characterized it as illegitimate and not representative of the American people, particularly minorities. At the Tribune, the NGO Parallel Conference, Afro-American women came to realize that their approach to women's oppression was similar to that of Southern feminists. They shared the same priorities, they shared the same belief as women from the South that men were partners in the fight against poverty. Such commonality pushed them to forge spontaneous international alliances with women of the South. On the global level, Afro-American women were no longer a minority, but represented the majority of peoples. Their claims could no longer be ignored. The building of transnational networks and alliances strengthened Afro-American women's voices and thus transformed power relations to some extent. As a result, 20 years later, In 1995, at the 4 United Nations Conference on Women, Afro-American women were no longer observers. They acted as coordinators and negotiators in international politics, speaking for the majority of women. Afro-American women leaders were part of the official U.S. delegation. For example, Dorothy Height of the National Congress of Negro Women was even nominated special advisor to the U.S. delegation for the 1994 conference, which was a conference which took place 1 year prior, before the Beijing conference, and it was the first conference which acknowledged women's perspective in population issues. So these women delegates were thus in direct contact with decision makers and served as a bridge with the African American Women's Caucus, which was initiated at the NGO Forum. If more than 2,100 NGOs had been accredited for the conference, the National Congress of Negro Women was one of the 51 NGOs allowed to deliver a speech at the official conference. In Beijing, Afro-American women were resolved to reframe the language used in international documents so that it recognized the special vulnerability of women who faced the double burden of race and gender. The main objective was, quote, to inject into the Beijing Platform of Action specific protection for women of color. Concretely, the efforts resulted in the inclusion of several paragraphs which explicitly refer to this kind of discrimination. In fact, at the second conference on women organized in Copenhagen in 1918, Afro-American women had already pragmatically advanced the intersectionality discourse abroad before it was even theorized by prominent feminist scholars in America. So that was Resolution 31. So the introduction of Resolution 31, entitled Women and Discrimination Based on Race, which turned, I quote, attention to the particular needs of the majority of the world's female population who suffers discrimination both based on race and sex, would have never happened without the efforts and involvement of 3 Afro-American women delegates who had been selected as official members of the U.S. delegation. The ultimate goal of these 3 women was to alter the conference negotiations on racial discrimination from solely apartheid to the broader concept of racism, sexism when discussing the roots of oppression of women. They sought to give the racism discourse both a political and social dimension. In fact, the 3 Afro-American delegates took on the responsibility to challenge their government, supposedly the main champion of democracy. They managed to overcome the U.S. State Department's reluctance to introduce such a resolution by using diplomatic protest. They presented the draft resolution to the press first. The aim of this action was to force the government to endorse this resolution, as they were convinced that the Carter administration had no choice but to give special consideration to this resolution if it wanted to act in coherence with its human rights discourse. So despite all these efforts and because of political issues, the United States voted against the amended resolution. I can better explain what it was exactly. Consequently, at the final press conference given by the head of the U.S. delegation, none of the Afro-American women delegates were present. The dissenting stance expressed anger against the lack of full support for the resolution. Nonetheless, they left with a moral victory as they were able to advance the intersectionality discourse to mobilize and negotiate an acceptable anti-racism statement. With the success, Afro-American women were determined to leave their mark on other women's key issues, such as the reproductive rights issues. One of the primary goals of these United Nations conferences was to tackle population issues, Under the leadership of the US, family planning was advocated as the best road to development. So many third world countries were pushed to adopt a Malthusian approach to population growth, thus restricting women's reproductive rights. Third world women's limited access to reproductive rights had a strong resonance among American women of color. Indeed, just like the sisters from the South, their bodies have been continuously instrumentalized in American society and politics. For American women of color, these conferences represented the ideal arena to debunk faulty accusation and to promote the perspective on the reproductive right discourse. In Mexico, in 1975, as some third world countries like Cuba attacked American family planning programs, even accusing them of genocide, Afro-American women decided to unveil their reproductive rights reality. They openly criticized Washington's stance on population issues and denounced abusive sterilization practices performed on American women of color. So, 10 years later in Nairobi, as Afro-American women were part of the majority, they felt ready to challenge mainstream American feminists. At Nairobi, it became clear that a true feminist international movement could not exist if it didn't take into account the claims and needs of the majority of women. So Afro-American women embarked on framing the debate around a unifying discourse based on the denial of their reproductive freedom. In contact with their international counterparts, they understood that they had to advance their reproductive rights discourse into a broader human rights framework. Just like the sisters from the South, they wanted to be recognized as human beings with specific needs and rights, and not just as numbers or targets of population policies. Denying them motherhood constituted a direct attack on their bodies, a human rights infringement. At Forum 85, a series of joint seminars culminated in the drafting of a joint declaration, Women's Right to Life, and this declaration pushed for concepts developed by Afro-American women. 10 years later, in Beijing, Afro-American women continued popularizing the reproductive rights framework, and they could influence the agenda more easily as key feminist black women leaders were at the negotiating table. In particular, 20 feminists from the Women of Color Coalition for Reproductive Health and Rights drafted a protest statement which was read at the third PrepCon for Cairo, so an official gathering. Many of the concepts that, mentioned in this protest statement were officially introduced in the Cairo and Beijing platform of actions. So with the inclusion of such paragraphs, demonstrate the influence Afro-American women had in the crafting of key resolutions and recommendations. Their ideas and perspectives pervaded the United Nations language on human rights. And thanks to these sophisticated alliances and strategies, they could gain more visibility and legitimize their voices.
First, I want to thank the conference organizers, Columbia University, IRAAS, and conference staff and participants. I've been really looking forward to this conference when I saw the call for papers back in September. And I said, even if I'm not able to present, I definitely want to attend because it's so rare that we have a chance to talk about African American women's intellectual history. Okay. Sure. So I'm glad to be participating in this conference and to be discussing these, I think, really interesting papers. So to my paper, Across the Trackless Ocean, here's a sketch of the subject of my paper, Mary Highland Garnett Barbosa. So the first question that may come to mind is, who was Mary Highland Garnett Barbosa? Why am I writing about her? Why do we care about her? And just to give you some biographical details, very short, Barbosa was born in Troy, New York on January 17th, 1845. She was the daughter of well-known abolitionists Julia Williams and Henry Highland Garnett. As a young woman, she traveled with her parents to England and the West Indies and worked alongside them on various educational activities in the United States during and after the Civil War. In many ways, she carried on the legacy of her notable parents by founding and later teaching at the Garnett Memorial School, which is a school for young women in Brewerville, Liberia, and she taught there for nearly 10 years. She died at a young age, 45, on December 2nd, 1890. Okay. So the location of Brewerville is near the St. Paul's River, about 15 miles from the nation's capital in Monrovia. Brewerville had been founded in 1870, and it was considered to be a more suitable area for agriculture than Monrovia. And of course, that's St. Paul's River, but in the previous slide, Liberia is located on the west coast of Africa and shares its borders with Sierra Leone, the Ivory Coast, and Guinea. So Liberia was called, the meaning of it, land of the free, shares a unique history with the United States. Emancipated African Americans founded it in 1821 with assistance from the American Colonization Society, a predominantly white organization that advocated the repatriation of African Americans to Liberia. So there were native tribes in Liberia, but Liberia, of course, far before African American colonization, including the Gola and Mandingos. And those are just two tribes, but there are more. So there are real tangible cultural differences that separated African American settlers who were called Americo-Liberians and indigenous African people, especially along religious practices and customs, social patterns, and daily life. Starvation, lack of resources, sickness, and death made Brewerville an especially difficult settlement in the early 1870s. So ever the optimist, educator and politician Edward Blyden remarked, quote, "The settlement of Liberia is growing to be the most important in Liberia." And by 1880, when Garnett Barbosa arrived, his statement seemed to hold true. Liberia offered Garnett Barbosa a transformative experience, an opportunity to share her ideas on marriage, civilization, education, and womanhood. So in this paper, I'm going to focus on some of her comments that appeared in American and British newspapers roughly from 1880 to 1890. She stated clearly that her overarching goal was to, quote, plead the cause of the women in Liberia. And in order to advance the cause, she kind of became an ambassador of Liberia. In her remarks in numerous newspaper articles, she linked the fate of the family and the future of the nation to the education of Liberian women. Ostensibly, Liberia would be a lost nation if it continued to ignore and exclude women from advanced education. And by extension, a weak and undereducated Liberia could not support and strengthen African Americans in the United States. The editor of the New York Freeman, T. Thomas Fortune, often publicized Garnett Barbosa's activities on her visits to New York City. So during one visit in March 1887, he assigned one of his editorial assistants of Shiloh Baptist Presbyterian Church, and she stated clearly he assigned one of his assistants to interview her. In her interview, William Green, that's the person who interviewed her, asked her questions about her activities in Liberia, and she said, quote, "I'm here in the U.S. to appeal to Americans to basically fundraise and send money to Liberia to support her school." So even in this fundraising effort, Barbosa sought to shape African American ideas and opinions about Liberia. Quote, "I fear Americans are falsely prejudiced against Liberia. I can't explain why. They should be just the opposite." And so she encouraged African Americans to read more about Liberia and to pick up a book by T. McCants Stewart. And he had just published a book on Liberia and the Americo-African Republic. If this interview with Green was any indication, it was her school and her female students that gave her a real sense of purpose. So what I'm going to provide are basically three snapshots that connect to marriage, civilization, and this idea of the dark continent. And all of these sort of snapshots that definitely overlap, but I'll be talking mostly about how they all connect to education. So a lack of educational opportunities for young women in Liberia, as well as gender divisions, placed young Liberian women at a real disadvantage, not just intellectually, but socially. And so these are the words of Mary Highland Garnett Barbosa. She describes the situation as such. The men are educated abroad and also marry abroad. I don't believe in that. The hope of Liberia is the girls. They should be trained, but they are neglected. If the men do not marry them, the Liberian people will disappear with the second or third generation. They should intermarry, and they would live forever as a people. It's a shame how the women are morally neglected and otherwise. So for Barbosa, the absence of schools for young Liberian women hurt the nation and the race. Both sexes, she argued, should be, quote, equally cultured. To that end, she taught Liberian women the principles of Christianity, domestic education, and more advanced subjects. And our hope was to nurture Liberian women who could become cultural equals to Liberian men and thus marriageable. In other words, the nation itself depended on educated women who could marry educated men, and together these families could then carry on the legacy of Liberia and help Liberia prosper. Garnett cast these, what I call, marriages for the Republic in noble terms, almost like a survival strategy and a tool for progress. At times in these interviews, Garnett Barbosa appeared to express great sympathy and strong feelings of benevolence toward Native Liberian women, but she also made statements about civilization that arguably revealed her, quote, Western mindset. For instance, she regarded the Americo-Liberians as naturally more civilized than Native people. And of course, part of her objective in the establishment of the Garnett Memorial School was to improve Liberia. She believed that the nation would flourish, quote, if we could only civilize the natives. Civilization, to her estimation, was a matter of education. And so she stated the problem quite precisely. Now, if a young native is civilized and Christianized, he can hardly be supposed to lead a happy family life with a wife of his own race who is utterly devoid of any education, who has not the slightest share in things which interest her husband, and who in fact is ignorant of almost everything. The civilized Negro is consequently more inclined to marry a white woman or to remain unmarried, either of which cases is most undesirable, as the propagation of a strong and healthy race is only possible if the natives marry among themselves. So differences in educational opportunities for young men and women produce these kinds of social problems. Neither interracial marriage nor being unmarried were suitable alternatives for young men in this new republic. To resolve this social predicament, Garnett Barbosa suggested that Native women be taught domestic education as well as, quote unquote, book learning. That a woman should be educated for her own sense of being was apparently not an argument that she advanced. Rather, the educated Liberian woman could perform her duty as a partner by being a Liberian man's intellectual companion, a role regarded as vital to national improvement and African uplift. In November 1988, Garnett Barbosa visited England and gave a lecture at the 78th annual meeting of the Manchester Geographical Society. Barbosa began her lecture with a discussion of the African slave trade, and then she talked about her experiences living and working in Liberia. She was surprised that, quote, so few people in England knew anything about the young nation. By 1888, she had been in Liberia for 7 years, and she'd been working to, again, develop her school for young Liberian women. And she wanted to do that, quote, to secure a better standard of education and family life. Her efforts had borne fruit, as she observed that the natives were, quote, coming to the belief that educated wives and mothers were wanted. Traveling to the United States and Britain to raise funds for the Garnett Memorial School actually turned Garnett Barbosa into a spokeswoman for Liberia, a nation that people either did not understand, as in the United States, or just knew nothing about, as in England. Through her extensive travels, she actually introduced Liberia to the West in some ways, and embedded her own ideas about civilization, marriage, and education. From New York City to Manchester, Mary Highland Garnett met with men of great political and social standing, and hence her public persona actually reconstituted the image of the African American woman as energetic, virtuous, and intelligent, and those were the terms used in newspaper articles to describe her. In an interview with the London-based newspaper, the Pall Mall Gazette, Garnet Barbosa described her desire to devote herself to the welfare of her own people. Her visit to London was strictly about pleading for subscriptions in order to erect permanent school buildings for her school. In this interview, she once again spoke of teaching in Liberia as well as her hope for the fledgling nation. When asked about the teachability of Native Liberian women, she intoned, "They are bright and intelligent and capable of high intellectual development, and they are delighted with all they learn." She even mentioned older Native women who were also desiring to gain literacy. So these young girls and women wanted to become literate, and they wanted to seek an advanced education, and that really challenged claims about African inferiority, which had been circulating in both the United States and Britain. With over 100 students enrolled in her school by 1888, Mary Highland Garnet Barbosa showed how her destiny as an African-American woman was linked to the destiny of these Native women. In response to Barbosa's comment that she needed some, quote, she needed a heating apparatus to keep her organ and pianos in tune, the interviewer asked her, what organs and pianos for the natives of the Dark Continent to practice on? And Garnet Barbosa responded in the affirmative, and then gently upbraided her interviewer for using the term Dark Continent. You talk of the Dark Continent, it is dark indeed, but mostly so in the estimation of Europeans as to the native races and resources, and men connected with our country have often confessed to me their entire ignorance of it. As for Liberia, its possibilities are almost without limit. We have a wealth of articles of commerce hidden away, ready for exportation. Our soil hides coal, salt, and marble. It grows cotton, tea, and coffee, the scent of the coffee bloom being an effective disinfectant within our reach. But in order to utilize them, we want greater civilization. And it is to help its advance among my people, I am here to plead the cause of the women. So even after this exchange, which carefully laid out how Liberia had been undergoing a transformation, the interview actually appeared in the Pall Mall Gazette with the title, An Open Door in the Dark Continent. Precisely the image that Garnet Barbosa rejected and wanted to kind of expunge from British and American minds. If anything, it illustrated the challenge her work really posed, not just in educating young Native Liberian women, but also in developing Pan-African characteristics as part of her larger project. On December 2nd, 1890, Garnet Barbosa died in Brewerville, Liberia. But I think her legacy is much more than that, and there hasn't been a lot of historical work on that. So by building an institution such as the Garnet Memorial School, by training young Native Liberian women, and then in turn training her own daughters to take over the school, she actually contributed to what I call a tradition of African American women's education. On one hand, she tapped into an emerging Pan-African sentiment when she championed the education of young Liberian women. She argued that women's education was paramount to the uplift of the race, not just in Liberia, but as part of the African diaspora. The Garnet Memorial School was then a manifestation of her ideas. However, the thoughts and ideas she expressed in her writings were complex and at times contradicted any kind of an emerging Pan-African spirit. Above all, Garnet Barbosa wanted to see Liberia grow and prosper, and for that to happen, she concluded that Native Liberian women had to become educated. And such a process was just as transformative for them as it was for her. Thank you.
Next, we'll have Tiffany Gil.
Thank you, and good morning. It's wonderful to be here for this event, and I am excited about all of the discussion that we're having and invigorated at this late point in the semester, so that's always a wonderful thing. I'll go ahead and get started. In 1954, 10 members of the National Association of Fashion and Accessory Designers, known as NAFAD, the premier organization for African Americans in the fashion industry, traveled to Europe at the urging of Madame Henri Bonnet, the wife of the French ambassador to the United States. Bonnet, whose fashion sensibilities earned her the coveted Neiman Marcus Award, met NAFAD's leaders at their very first annual meeting in 1950 and was so impressed that she implored their newly elected president, Freddie Henderson, to bring a group of women to Europe to partake in the fashion international trade shows occurring on the continent. The Atlanta-based Henderson agreed and took the lead in arranging travel for the group. The women, NAFAD's key leaders, flew to Europe on a Pan-American jet to Paris and continued their journey through the continent, stopping in Rome and London to visit famed fashion houses and attend fashion shows. Henderson also served as a reporter, sending reviews of the various fashion shows they attended to the Associated Negro Press, becoming the first African American to cover such events. Perhaps more significantly, Henderson, as the primary organizer for the travel, navigated what was uncharted territory for all of the women, since none of them had ever ventured outside the United States. Indeed, Henderson was so impressed by her experiences with the travel agencies she worked with, as well as the lack of overt racism she and the women believed they did not encounter abroad, that upon her return to the United States, she explained to her husband Jacob, quote, "I think more black people would travel if they knew how easy it was," end quote. In 1955, with no initial capital beyond their personal savings, the Hendersons opened a travel services business in a space they rented from a black-owned bookstore on Atlanta's famed Auburn Avenue. Mrs. Henderson was at the helm and would continue to direct the agency's operations for another 40 years. By all accounts, the Henderson Travel Agency was the first black-owned travel agency to cater solely to clients seeking travel destinations outside the United States. Indeed, Freddie Henderson took a wise entrepreneurial risk at a strategic moment. While the history of African Americans is centered around voluntary and forced international journeys, the experiences of blacks during World War II, along with the significant changes in American politics and culture in the post-war period, made African American international tourist industry not only possible, but lucrative. Technological advancements in air travel and unprecedented growth in black family incomes, increased international attention paid to issues of racial inequality, and the rise of post-colonial nations in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean made the post-war period of significance, particular significance for issues related to black internationalism. International leisure travel was especially important for shaping the lives of African American women, who not only partook of these travel opportunities in higher rates than men, but were also at the forefront of building black tourism's entrepreneurial infrastructure. And despite substantial archival evidence to the contrary, there are still scholarly debates as to whether African Americans even engaged in leisure travel in significant ways before the 1980s. There's certainly this long, rich tradition of which Barbosa and others are a part of African Americans traveling abroad, and it's usually spoken of solely within political terms, activist terms, but in terms of leisure travel, that's something that hasn't really been addressed. It seems as though the analysis of political travel has been privileged over seemingly frivolous travel for pleasure, as if the two could ever be disentangled, I think. And for scholars that have recognized that African Americans do indeed travel, few have acknowledged that African Americans engage in such leisure pursuits outside of the U.S. So in this paper, I'm just going to give a brief overview to examine the ways in which African American women, travel entrepreneurs, and tourists provided an intellectual framework and analysis of the rapidly changing post-war world. Indeed, even those who did not travel abroad were influenced by the public discourse on international travel that was shaped, created, and disseminated primarily by black women. While tourists, particularly black women tourists, were often dismissed by contemporary scholars and activists as frivolous and fanciful, I contend that the history of black women international leisure travelers in the post-war era encourages a necessary discussion about the need to interrogate leisure spaces as sites of intellectual development. Specifically, this paper will examine the ways that actual travel abroad, as well as public discussions of travel in the black press, framed black women's national, professional, and economic identities. Now, when Henderson went about to establish this travel agency, she certainly was not without her challenges. Early on, she had to develop a rationale for black international travel. And while it's easy to dismiss her rationales and her ideas as merely marketing tools, I contend that a much deeper intellectual process was at work here. First, she realized that selling international travel as an escape from Jim Crow would be a welcome message to African Americans who, eager to consume leisure travel, often found the indignities and uncertainties of how they would be treated in hotels, shops, and restaurants throughout the United States, particularly in the South, unappealing. In addition, Henderson realized that one way to help African Americans overcome any concerns they had about traveling abroad to unknown lands for the first time was to market highly scheduled vacation packages, complete with tour guides at every stop along the way, to groups and organizations as opposed to individual travelers, couples, or families. And so much of this early travel that's happening in the post-war period are these very highly scheduled vacation packages that were often offered to Black women's sorority groups, professional groups, etc., instead of thinking about travel in terms of a group or in terms of a family or an individual choice. Furthermore, Henderson understood that African American travelers may have harbored some guilt about indulging in the extravagance of international leisure travel. This often had less to do with the actual financial commitment than with the fear of being perceived as being frivolous for investing the time necessary for an international journey. Particularly in the 1950s and 60s, where there was so much activity here in the United States of people putting their lives on the line for the freedom struggle, the image in the Black press of African American women going throughout Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean seemed to be problematic. To combat this, Freddie Henderson created travel itineraries that emphasized educational and professional development. Tours were often marketed to professional organizations as extensions to their stateside annual meetings and included time for these professionals to meet with their occupational counterparts abroad. Henderson also found that traditional advertisements were insufficient in drawing new customers into this unfamiliar terrain of foreign travel. She recognized that the unknown nature of travel beyond the U.S. necessitated a wider forum to educate, inform, and even entice African Americans to sign up for one of her excursions. To that end, she authored a weekly column in the Pittsburgh Courier entitled Travel by Freddie, which ran from 1957 to 1963, and provided a forum for international travelers to describe their escapades and allowed Henderson to give practical advice on everything from obtaining a passport to purchasing a car overseas. Other Black publications witnessed the popularity of Henderson's column and quickly became interested, and I argue obsessed, with African Americans abroad. And if you look in this period, particularly from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s, from the Pittsburgh Courier, Ebony was huge on this, and sort of these large pictorial, multi-page spreads, as well as short travelogues from African Americans traveling abroad. And what I was sort of grappling with in this paper is, what if we look at these newspaper entries and these pictorial accounts as travel narratives in the ways in which we have analyzed traditional travel narratives. And certainly the collections like Alastair Pettinger's Always Elsewhere, and of course Farrah Griffin and Cheryl Fish's work, A Stranger in the Village, on 2 centuries of African American travel writing, have done much, in the words of Pettinger, to quote, decolonize or democratize travel literature. And this call to expand travel literature, I think, would be enriched by considering the extensive press coverage and travel advice columns that were abundant in the Black press at this time. Black women like Freddie Henderson educated readers about these places, and more importantly, demystified the process of international travel with practical advice. They also implicitly engaged in debates with scholars who grappled with the consumption-driven post-war Black middle class. And for me, in sort of thinking about this period and consumption as a way in which to enter the Black middle class in the post-war period, as opposed to some of the more elitist ways in the early 20th century, it seemed as though in my rendering that traveling abroad became this great way for people to sort of make a claim into the Black middle class identity by saying they traveled abroad. These columns also help to shape the world, and for the sake of time, I'll be quick, but the agency becomes the first agency to work extensively with travel to Western Africa. In fact, one of her agency's biggest trips was the decolonization celebrations in Ghana, and she's the one who actually planned the entire travel itinerary for the delegates, who went there as part of this political delegation, but then also spent weeks traveling around the rest of Africa as well. And so in a 1962 column, she really wanted to highlight that Africa was indeed not a dark continent for her black readers, but that Africa, in her estimation, offered a strange paradox, to use her words. In a 1962 column, she explained that, quote, in certain sections of Africa, you can still see most of the species of wild animals from the gentle antelope to the great carnivore, but you have to travel in a refrigerator-equipped bus to find them. She also wanted to make sure that the black readers of her Pittsburgh Courier column understood that, quote, there are thriving metropolitan and cosmopolitan areas with modern banks, industries, and air-conditioned deluxe hotels that belie their setting. And Henderson, ever the astute saleswoman, ends her observations of the continent with what sounds like a marketing tagline, quote, Africa must be seen to be believed. The Travel by Freddie column also illuminated a conflict that Henderson and other travel entrepreneurs encountered as they developed an ideology of black international travel. Should international travel be demystified and promoted as something widely available to African Americans across a range of income levels, or should travel be considered as an exclusive status for newly emerging black middle class? With European adventures being priced at approximately $1,000 and trips to the African continent topping over $2,000, the cost was a huge sacrifice and even insurmountable for many African Americans. And so she worked out this very elaborate payment plan system that allowed many people to go. So much so that a travel agent said that, quote, that travel was becoming a great experience for mass income groups, he calls it, from the telephone company employee to save up for a little splurge. But this caused some tension from some folks that Henderson worked with who were afraid that everyone was traveling abroad. And she had this quote. She said in January 1962, this is a quote from Henderson's column, a good friend of mine made a very stupid statement the other day. She said she did not want to go to Europe because everybody goes there now. That's like saying you do not want $1 million because millionaires are getting to be commonplace, or that you don't want to go to heaven because too many people are trying to get there, or that you never plan to fall in love because people are enjoying love's ecstasy, or that you never plan to have children because motherhood is not selective. How ridiculous can we get? The best things in life are those that are personally fulfilling to you. So to me, she's sort of building this case, of course, for her agency and travel, but that she's doing it around these kind of post-war middle-class trope of marriage and religion and a not-so-veiled marker about love and sex and all these things, motherhood. So she's sort of putting travel within these kind of very post-war middle-class tropes as well. And despite attempts on the part of Henderson and other travel professionals to promote international travel as a possibility for most African Americans, there were vociferous critiques about the increase in black international travel from those within the academic community who perceived it as a select privilege of the black middle class. The black press's obsession with facts such as what travelers wore and how much money they spent at different points of call was the cause of much consternation. Perhaps the most vitriolic critic was sociologist and scholar E. Franklin Fraser, who in his very well-known polemic Black Bourgeoisie, originally published in 1955 and then translated in 1957, described this press coverage specifically. He targets it and calls it, and says that it, quote, creates a world of make-believe to satisfy the cravings of the black bourgeoisie for recognition. He goes on to say these fanciful reports, his words, are provided for the black bourgeoisie who remain at home. And while I think Fraser's assertion that the reports were fanciful and created a world of make-believe is a bit unfair, I think he was absolutely right to point out the ways in which this press coverage played an important role for those who were unable or unwilling to take the same journey. However, since the black press was read so widely in the black community, I assert that these reports were not only for the black bourgeoisie who may have had the disposable income to actually travel abroad, but also for those who may not have had the opportunity to travel. And rather than simply sharing these travel accounts, the press coverage, I think, is really taking an active role in shaping African Americans, women in particular, view of the world, allowing African Americans to kind of see themselves within a much wider, larger cosmopolitan context and to view themselves within this very rapidly changing post-war world. And so scholars often look to the historical record left by writers, artists, expatriates, and political leaders as windows into the intellectual underpinnings of post-war black internationalism. This view is incomplete, I argue, without taking seriously the ways that African-American women travelers and travel entrepreneurs like Freddie Henderson grappled with the complex meanings associated with black bodies in motion in this moment of great transition. It's my hope that this work, which I've just sort of briefly laid out, will situate black women tourists as key shapers papers and the discourses that shaped Black international engagement in the post-war, and illuminate the matrix of class, gender, internationalism, and entrepreneurship in Black women's lives. Thank you.
And last, we have Alexis Gums.
This is for those of us who live at the shoreline and those of us who live on the deadline, hustling to make a living off ever more glamorous analyses of systematic death. Driven by the intellectual marketability of the paradox, though life is all we can theorize, some lives remain incomprehensible. Though death is a limit of theory, some deaths are so predictable as to seem understandable. We are the purveyors of the horizon, approaches to sensibility that continue to recede because life escapes us and death prevails. For those of us who live on the shifting edge of the world, close or brave or stupid enough to sell the details of the line we walk, to guess the conversation between sea, sand, and air, for those of us who know the truth of erosion and bet against it, this is for us. It is impossible for me to paraphrase the long and truly unfinished paper that I wrote for this working group, so I tend towards the poetic. What I offer this morning is more like an invocation for some work I want us to be able to continue together. Something like a ritual of continuity, something like the practice of intellectual history as a performance of critical ancestral presence. As Sylvia Wynter reminds us, after humanism, the ceremony must be found. And I understand this weekend as a ceremonial occasion where we collectively interrogate and affirm what it means to dedicate our lives to this work and to participate in intellectual history that we must also create. In 1983, in the October issue of Essence magazine, Alexis DeVoe published an article called Sister Love, in which she articulated her Black women-centered sexual and political vision of love. The first words of the article are, "I am a daughter of Africa." And at the closing, she confesses her deepest and possibly most controversial desire. I want to join heart and hand with the world movement of women rising out of the ashes of oppression, making bonds, as women of the Caribbean, Central America, and Africa have, to be radical and transformative. I want a new society. In the same issue of Essence, side by side in places, Audre Lorde first published her essay, Black Women's Anger. Audre Lorde started her essay with the words, "I know the anger that lies inside me like the beat of my heart and the taste of my spit," and ended the first paragraph with a list of the thoughts that go through her head when she feels rejected by another Black woman, the last one being, "Oh, sister, where is that dark, rich land we wanted to wander through together?" Going on to say, "We are African women, and we know in our blood's telling the tenderness with which our foremothers held each other. It is that connection we are seeking. Daughters of Africa, in heart and hand, the taste of spit, the telling of blood, the dark, rich land, the wandering together." This paper examines the erotics and poetics of blood and water and land in the work of two Black lesbian feminist writers who were explicit about desire and specific about the role they believed they and other Black women situated in the United States should share politically and economically in relationship to Black women oppressed by the imperial influence of the United States, specifically as manifested in the iconography and practice of SISA, Sisters in Support of Sisters in South Africa, which I am giving to you because I am a Black woman living in this country, which in my view is still, as Audre Lorde said in 1985, on the wrong side of every struggle on the planet. I see myself as a transnational Black feminist and a sister to women of color all over the planet, and that proposition, that form of desire, has not gotten any less messy over time. The archive of blood and water and land that I look at here was mostly brought into my life by Cheryl Green, who in collaboration with Alexis DeVoe used the most popular Black women's magazine in the United States, Essence, from the late 1970s to the early 1980s to engage and document a depth of work invoking radical political solidarity and a framework for Black transnationalist feminists that would seem impossible today
in Essence magazine, and which was sharply curtailed after an article with a provocative photo of a soldier standing on a young boy's neck and critiquing the U.S. invasion of the first Black Socialist Republic of Grenada, which frightened advertisers into threatening to pull their contracts and made it a lot less easy to maneuver. Alexis DeVoe's work as poetry editor and then editor-at-large to cover the role of women in liberation movements in Southern Africa and the role of U.S. imperialism in apartheid and the violent regime in Haiti articulates the economics of blood and water and the bridge of fluid-based solidarity that she envisions as an appropriate stance for Black women and, by extension, Black communities in the United States. The archive of this series of articles, in combination with the correspondence and promotional materials of CISA in the archive papers of Audre Lorde, Toni Cade Bambara, and Joseph Beam, is charged with desire and loss. To engage this archive with a desire to produce intellectual history is also to reveal a deep desire for the dead, a longing and lust for what was once possible at Essence, a place for critical Black transnationalist feminist theory and a publication that reaches the mass of Black American women, and a desire for ancestral presence in an engagement with the letters and materiality of a set of dead Black feminist intellectuals, Audre Lorde, Toni Cade Bambara, Joseph Beam, who we wish were here today. To use the pamphlets they kept is to invoke the materiality of their presence. To caress the articles via microfiche is to dream of an essence long gone in more ways than one. 1. Blood. Poet and novelist Jewel Gomez, best known for her Black lesbian vampire novel The Gilda Stories, advances this description of her own theorization of blood in We Take Blood, Not Life, the afterword to the 10th anniversary edition of the novel. It means that we are interconnected, that our survival is dependent on our exchanges with each other, and that our balance is kept only when we give and take as needed. The imagery that Gomez uses to depict the transfer of blood and dreams that takes place in the Gilda Stories is a mothering image of breastfeeding. She explicitly makes a comparison to breastfeeding and refers to it in a pretty essentialist way, referring to biology to remind us that, quote, symbiotic relationships aren't always immediately and mutually agreed upon, and suggesting that a mother who refuses to breastfeed is breaking one of the covenants of society. Gomez's theory of blood developed as she wrote the Gilda Stories in intense conversation with Alexis DeVoe, whose Gap-Toothed Girlfriend's living room workshops she participated in, and who Gomez transformed the Gilda Stories from a series of short stories into a novel with the guidance of Audre Lorde. And so her theorization of blood seems directly relevant to the uses of blood in the archive that I am obsessed with. Might it be that some of the motherland images that Black feminists in the United States associated with both the Caribbean and the continent as home spaces held some of this desire, this sought-after nurturance, this wish that a covenant could hold across slavery, across different relationships to empire? We know that in slavery, breastfeeding was one of the most alienable forms of labor related to Black women's bodies, and enslaved people who could lactate were forced to breastfeed whoever it was convenient to breastfeed in the household, and no unbreakable covenant emerged from that action or that intimacy, neither in the case of biological or chosen enslaved children who could be sold away, or in the case of white children who would grow up to be unaccountable across the difference of race and condition of servitude. What about the blood ties that imaginatively connected Black feminists with Black women in struggle in the Caribbean and Africa? Were the ties wanted, imposed, meaningful in the same ways across water? Might the suggestion that symbiotic relationships aren't always immediately and mutually agreed upon reveal submerged possibilities in relationships with covenants that social systems like slavery and capitalism do not respect? Might it be a way to imagine relationships, commonalities, and accountability across extreme differences in privilege, like, for example, Black feminists in the United States and sister comrades in spaces that the imperial US would suck the lifeblood from? Or, as Gomez explains, the difference between the good vampires in the family that Gilda is a part of and the bad vampires is that the bad vampires are, quote, kind of like multinational corporations. In Apartheid USA, an essay that Audre Lorde wrote to mobilize Black Americans as she listened to the UN Special Session on the state of emergency in South Africa in 1985, she says, "So much Black blood has been shed upon that land. I thought so much more will fall, but blood will tell, and now the blood is speaking." Lord makes a blood connection between 12-year-old Johannes kicked to death in front of his garden, 9-year-old Joyce bleeding to death on her granny's floor, the slaughter of black children and youth in the roads of Sebokeng and Soweto, all the children that South African police jail and murder, and white America's, this is a quote, white America's not so silent applause for the smiling white vigilante who coolly guns down 4 black youths in the New York City subway, white policemen who kill 3 black children over a dispute over a can of Coca-Cola. Audre Lorde goes on to create a litany of blood spilled, intent on convincing her black US-based audience that there is a blood relation, imposed even if it is never chosen, ending her litany furious with the example of the murder of the members of the MOVE organization. Quote, because they were dirty and black, and obnoxious and black, and arrogant and black, and poor and black, and black and black and black and black, and the mayor who allowed this to happen, he is black too. How are we persuaded to participate in our own destruction by maintaining our silences? End quote. It is this discourse of blood, not blood essentially flowing through our patriarchally linked veins, but blood shed and swallowed by the ground, a shared condition of expendability that might lead to what cultural anthropologists have called fluidarity, an intervention into solidarity that allows for an accountable connection without fixed identities, especially relevant to the exchange of fluids imagined here. And it is this fluidarity, blood falling and telling, that allows Audre Lorde to ask African Americans in the United States, do you even know which companies your money supports that do business in South Africa? To ask, how long will it take to escalate our consciousness as black people that this is us? It is the discourse of blood that 2 years earlier allowed Alexis DeVoe to point out to the readers of Essence magazine that the Haitian people are put in such economically dire situations by the US-supported regime that they are selling their blood by the pint for export to American firms. She asks, do we care? These blood ties are far from an effort to create a simple black unity. But as DeVoe insists in the same essay, words tie blood knots. This public relationship of blood to a critical diasporic injunction circulates and gains contours in the local intellectual space of Alexis DeVoe's living room. In the introduction to the self-published anthology Gap-Toothed Girlfriends, the third act, Alexis DeVoe describes the diasporic space of the Gap-Toothed Girlfriends workshop using language of blood and a gap to be bridged. Quote, we are women of all persuasions, a community of Africans. We come from South Carolina, New York City, Puerto Rico, South Africa, and blood places in between. Note there are no commas between these places. She continues, we come as strangers and friends, we become sisters. So without the division of commas or any directive to breathe, the space between the names of the locations become possible blood places, space where relationship is made or transformed. Before the somewhat narrative description of the workshop, DeVoe has already offered a more poetic description of the bridging work that transforms the space in between into blood places of sisterhood. Continuity, the will to survive, believe in the unseen, sheer and delicate, belief in self, in another black woman, a risky idea, to support it by paying for it, unite to ignite, to know that we are doing it, got to do, to be a movement, build it in stages like a bridge, be one, a bridge, change the world and take our lives and make them better, thrust them forward. The passage is performative. Continuity defined or constructed barely gets an uninterrupted sentence. Commands are the closest thing. Otherwise we have subjects alone, infinitive predicates, a floating implied you for the reader. This passage causes the reader to question whether continuity is real or a trick, and if survival is the way we become bridges to each other, based on the risky practice of investing in black women, which everyone agreed was a risky practice in the punitive welfare queen discourse of the 1980s. Where is the forward that we are thrusting ourselves towards with these consecutive but punctually cut off bridges? How is it that we believe in self, risk ourselves in another black woman to be a movement, build a bridge, be one, be a bridge? And how do we pay for it? Water. DeVoe articulates a diasporic vision that she thinks should lead to political action by American-based black communities on behalf of and in conversation with Haitian refugees detained in the United States. The Haitian refugees who have been, this is a quote, the Haitian refugees who have been imprisoned in the detention camps of West Virginia, Kentucky, Puerto Rico, New York, Louisiana, Texas, and Florida are black people first of all. our people, descendants of Africans and African slaves, Caribbean sister brother members of the Black diaspora, so we are family in the original sense, end quote. But for DeVoe, this original sense is by no means traditional. She goes on to create a definition of family and peoplehood that is not trite or nostalgic, but poetic and visionary. What is familiar to one another is also unfamiliar. What binds us propels us, scatters us in a Gulf Stream. What binds us propels us, scatters us. What is familiar? The familiar phrase that DeVoe uses to ground her argument and clarify her intervention is, blood is thicker than water, and our people need our help. She will repeat the act of claiming our people 3 times in the opening 3 paragraphs of her polemic. What is familiar? Water. What binds us, Black expendability, propels us. DeVoe uses the journey across water as a place of tragic familiarity between Haitian refugees and the American descendants of enslaved Africans. Quote, the Haitians are the 2nd largest wave of Blacks to America since slavery. Across the same Atlantic Ocean, the same fear, thirst, and hunger. They've come in the holds of cargo ships. Many whole families have drowned. Water is familiar, but water also carries a difference. Explaining the motivation of Haitian refugees to flee, DeVoe emphasizes a major difference between Black poverty in the United States and Black poverty in Haiti. Clean water is not available. Quote, women give their children water from the gutter in rusted cans, end quote. This image, juxtaposed against the image of struggling African Americans worrying about, quote, whether we can pay the rent or get to work or feed the kids, end quote, offers both connection and clarity. What is it that Black American citizens could stop taking for granted that would allow us not to accept the fact that we are flushing drinkable water down the toilet while countless mothers are forced to give their children gutter water? What will what binds us propel us to give up? How is it that we believe in self, risk ourselves in another Black woman to be a movement, build a bridge, be one, be a bridge? And how do we pay for it? Land. Maybe the economic acts of solidarity engaged in by the sisterhood in support of sisters in South Africa, founded as a form of recognition and financial support of the South African women's self-help movement as a form of resistance to apartheid, and relationships with 2 specific self-help organizations, the Zamani Soweto Sisters and the Maggie Magaba Trust, engages in the poetics of water and blood towards not only a bridge of fluidity, but some dark, rich land where something can grow. Remember how Audre Lorde, one of the self-named founding mothers of CISA, had said black and black and black and black and black. It is that sound of the heartbeat persisting, of waves hitting the shore again and again, fluid but persistent. Listen, sisterhood in support of sisters in South Africa. Every time you say it, there is a bloodstream replicated, a waterway traveled, but it lands in South Africa. Remember, Alexis DeVoe said, become sisters. CISA is an acronym version of the Hosa word mercy, to produce sisterhood. The logo on the early brochure is hand-drawn, 2 arms reaching across a horn that envelops the United States and Africa, holding each other at the pulse place, the wrist, what Alexis DeVoe might call the blood place of sisterhood. So where blood and water cannot be separated, or where they thicken into a poetically argued, ethical, practical, and economic place to stand, do they become Audre Lorde's sought-after, dark, rich land? Do they offer the new society that Alexis DeVoe has been lusting after all this time? Or are we still standing here, on the bridge, calculating the risk of our investment, on the bridge, calculating how to be one, a bridge, and how we pay for it?
Now we'll have a comment from Alexandra Cornelius-Diallo.
Good. Is it afternoon now? I think. Good morning into afternoon.
Yeah.
It is really my pleasure to be here to comment on these fabulous papers, and I look forward to opening it up to further discussion as well. This panel, of course, examines the role of Black women intellectuals whose work was either rooted or informed by a desire to engage and apply their knowledge within a broad transnational understanding of the world in which they lived. Like many of the papers in this conference, the women examined are thinkers who seek practical benefits, if not tangible results, from their intellectual work. In doing so, the scholars here present, open our eyes to the extent to which what we deem as intellectual can be broadened further. They present us with opportunities to reconceptualize how we define intellectual. We find through these papers that Black women's intellectual work is often deeply embedded in the spiritual, physical, economic, and political goals of the respective communities which the women seek to represent. I'll start with the first paper that was presented and go out of order of what I have here. Fatma Ramdani's paper, Challenging the Human Rights Discourse, Afro-American Women at Work During the 4 United Nations Conferences on Women, stands to possibly actually challenge the paradigm with which we understand African-American women's intellectual work. She offers a view of Black women's intellectual work that is communal in nature. So for most of us who are focused on African-American women's intellectual work, we still focus on maybe one people or one person or two people in conversation with each other, one writer, one politician, one activist. What Ramdani is offering is a much more communal approach to our understanding of what intellectual work looks like. In her paper, there is no great man. Not in this conference, there is, but there isn't necessarily a great woman either. Instead, we see collectives of women working together to challenge the status quo. More specifically, she examines the extent to which African-American feminists, through international conferences, framed American foreign policy and international human rights discourse. In doing so, she argues that they also significantly challenge mainstream feminist discourse. Specifically, and I loved all of the details that she gives us about the tangible ways in which she can locate and the impact that these women were having on the development of the discourse. She looks at the ways in which, for example, African-American women influenced the framing of Resolution 31, Women and Discrimination Based on Race, introduced at the Second UN Conference in Copenhagen in 1980. She also examines the contribution to a reconceptualization of the reproductive rights and justice framework. African-American women's groups, according to Ramdani, raise questions about systemic structures of economic development. They employ different strategies, including insubordination. The example she provides is a letter of protest at the 1995 Beijing conference, protesting the fact that women of color were denied a tent meeting, but other interest groups such as stateless women, older women, and lesbians were offered a tent meeting. She argues that African-American women also set up international women of color networks that took into account various women's views. She argues that they formulated theory from lived experiences. She also looks at the ways in which they employ diplomatic protests, presenting resolutions to the press. Significantly, these women are also questioning the dominant feminist theories. The discussion of the ways in which these women worked actively to reframe reproductive freedom as a matter of social justice is important. She shows the extent to which they tied this discussion about reproductive freedom to a broader human rights discourse, focusing not only on the right of abortion, but also the right to have children in healthy environments to healthy mothers, looking at a much more systemic way in which to address these questions. My question is a question of further clarification. I would like to understand the discussion of luxury items or luxury issues to which the African-American women distance themselves from. Among those luxury issues, we find childcare, equal pay, and reproductive choice. And Ramdani argues that these were considered luxury issues by African-American women. And I just wanted to know why, specifically childcare. I can speculate about equal pay in the context of a racist society, but why childcare was deemed a luxury issue? Is that because of the systems of support within the community, whatever have you? I want to turn now to Cabria Baumgardner's paper, Across the Trackless Ocean, Mary Highland Garnet Barboza. Baumgartner's paper examines the understudied work of Mary Highland Garnet Barboza, Those with whom the name Highland Garnet rings a bell learn quickly that Mary Highland Garnet Barbosa ably continued her abolitionist parents' efforts to improve the prospects for blacks in the United States as well as in Liberia. In her effort to piece together the important contributions of this little-known educator, Baumgartner mined numerous newspapers, making especially good use of T. Thomas Fortune's New York Freeman, as well as a number of Garnet Barbosa's lectures and writings. Baumgartner argues that the overlooked Garnet Barbosa became a leader in educational thought during the late 19th century. As one of her contemporaries observed, Garnet Barbosa planted, quote unquote, planted an intellectual standard for minds thirsting after knowledge. More specifically, Garnet Barbosa became an advocate for women's education in Liberia. To that end, she founded a school for young women in Brewerville, Liberia, where she promoted training, what Baumgartner refers to as advanced training and domestic education, quote unquote. Significantly, Garnet Barbosa's intellectual work was shaped by a Christian understanding of her mission in Liberia. Moreover, as Baumgartner asserts, Garnet Barbosa was one of the first African-American women educators to emphasize the critical necessity to educate Liberian women to ensure a viable future not only for Liberia, but also for the Africans and their descendants throughout the diaspora. In 1887, Garnet Barbosa conducts a fundraising trip for a visit from a fundraising trip to New York City, gives numerous lectures, and expresses real concerns not only about American prejudice against Liberia, but also about her concerns about the Liberian economy. The personal for Garnet Barbosa is also political. She criticized Liberian men who married abroad, fearing that Liberian women would fail to find partners, consequently leading to the disappearance of Liberian people. Instead, Liberian women, Garnet argued, should embrace marriages for the Republic. Baumgartner's paper hints at and perhaps could develop further a few of the complicated issues regarding the relationship between African Americans and Liberians. The Garnet Barbosa case does not seem to evoke a situation in which the formerly colonized, or in this case the descendant of an enslaved person, becomes a colonizer. Garnet's understanding of Islam indicates a more nuanced, if not respectful, attitude toward Liberian culture and mores. In addition, she did also critique the use of the trope of the dark continent. Yet to what extent did the civilizing mission and nascent prejudice toward Liberians inform her insistence on the importance of domestic education? How does Garnet Barbosa define domestic education? Is it pedagogically informed by the post-emancipation philosophy of industrial education that later would be championed by Booker T. Washington? Or is it more rooted in a gendered understanding of women's roles both in the household and in society at large? Is it possible to uncover exactly what it was these women were learning about domestic life that they did not know before? It always fascinates me how, people want to teach you how to be domestic. It's like, it's something I think that you learn along the way. Moreover, more information on the ways her Christian beliefs inform her educational philosophy also would shed light on the ways Garnet Barbosa applied Christian teachings to her educational philosophy. We'll move quickly now to Tiffany Gil's paper. In her paper, in Baumgartner's paper, she makes reference to the grueling nature of missionary work. Tiffany Gil's paper ostensibly takes us away from all that, introducing us to women's forays into the world of fashion during the 1950s. We move from Liberia to Europe, where we encounter Freddie Henderson, president of the National Association of Fashion and Accessory Designs. According to Gill, she became the owner of the first black-owned travel agency that catered to blacks seeking travel destination outside of the United States. We quickly learned that this enterprise was not of a frivolous nature. Henderson identified and capitalized on a lucrative entrepreneurial opportunity. Gill points out that scholars have paid more attention to political travel as opposed to travel for pleasure. Such categorization stubbornly refuses to acknowledge the extent to which even political travel brought moments of psychological, emotional, and spiritual reprieve to even the most committed freedom fighters in African American history. So these freedom fighters, intellectuals are people too, Gill seems to imply. Likewise, African Americans' ability to embrace the right and certainly the privilege of travel for leisure can be read politically when viewed as a defiant decision to those who deem black bodies as always already tied to the laboring needs of the nation state. And this whole thing brought up in my mind the hullabaloo behind Michelle Obama's decision to take her daughter to Spain last summer, or even earlier on in his presidency, Obama's decision to take his wife to New York. There was a lot of consternation about, this leisure time taken by the first family. More precisely for our purposes, Gill identifies Henderson's contribution to the discourse of international travel as intellectual work. This original essay illuminates the ways in which public discussion about travel in the Black press helped African Americans to see themselves beyond the limited and racist context of post-war United States society. Gill argues that marketing international travel so it would appeal to Jim Crow-weary patrons required deep intellectual processes. Sensitive to the patrons' fears that travel would be deemed frivolous by African American clients, she packaged tours that emphasize the educational and professional benefits of travel. Gill challenges Fraser's dismissal of the oft-reported world of make-believe by asserting that Black press coverage of Blacks traveling abroad gave African Americans a more cosmopolitan outlook. The incorporation of the discourse of Black tourism presents intriguing avenues of inquiry. My questions for Gill include, did the advertisements crafted by Henderson and others ever make indirect references to politics at home? Were there visual contrasts made implicitly between life at home and travel abroad? In fact, for example, did they depict integrated buses in France, or kids walking with poodles, and as opposed to being chased by dogs? So I'm interested in how those things are read against each other. Also, I wanted to learn more about the sponsor tours to Africa, the extent to which they are engaging maybe African American scholars who are writing about Africa, or Black people also encouraged to travel to the Caribbean or to the Black Atlantic, other places in the Black Atlantic, Latin America, and to what extent are whites drawn to advertisements for hanging out in Black-dominated areas as well? So there's a two-way street. The comeback to Jamaica ads, for example, weren't necessarily geared toward Jamaicans. And so what is the flip side of the way in which this discourse of Black tourism may have also influenced whites? The next stop on our intellectual journey takes us to the dark, rich land of Alexis Pauline Gums' paper, from a poetics of a relation to an economics of solidarity between Black women in the United States and South Africa. What immediately struck me when I first began reading the paper was the extent to which Gums invites the reader to join her on her intellectual process. And interestingly, I didn't have the introduction that you used here, but interestingly enough, she did the same thing here in person. The paper offers an example of the process of a Black female intellectual recovering the work of a Black female intellectual. Using the tropes of blood, water, and land, Gums solidifies the ancestral tie between herself and her ancestral mothers, including Audre Lorde and Alexis DeVoe. On page 3 of her paper, Gums informs the reader that she is a Black woman, a transnational feminist, and a sister to women of color all over the planet, quote unquote. What is fascinating to me is that she encourages the reader to feel her Blackness long before she identifies herself as such. Her use of language, the sister-to-sister intimate nature of her tone, the continual references to blood, water, and land, the craving that she talks about for connections to other women of color all seem to resonate with at least Gums' depiction of a Black female identity. For Gums, I venture to say that intellectual work, both hers and that of her subjects of study, is inextricably tied with identity, with feeling, and with emotion, and that these two do not compete with each other, but only serve to enhance each other in the intellectual process. In calling attention to this aspect of Gums' paper, I do not wish to be misunderstood. I'm not arguing for an essentialist understanding of the production of Black women's intellectual work, but I think it is worthy of attention to this particular Black women's process to call attention to that. Perhaps an analysis of the way in which identity serves her in her process can help us to theorize identity politics and our own personal motives, all of us here, as we seek to produce scholarship on Black women intellectuals. In the paper, Gums is troubled. She is nervous about the extent to which Black women situated here in the U.S. of A., as she says, on the wrong side of every liberation struggle, may inadvertently, to use Lloyd's phrase, use the masses' tool to dismantle the masses' house in their attempts to forge political ties to Caribbean and African women. Gums sees hope in the work of Lorde. According to Gums, Lorde constructs bridges, thus sealing the spaces, quote unquote, the spaces where people fall through. For Gums, Lorde's contribution is the possible creation of a different relationship, one not steeped in a quote unquote globalized racist relationship through capitalism. Gums observes that DeVoe rigorously engaged in the political situation in Haiti and in South Africa. I would argue that perhaps additional attention to Lord's essays as they complement the analysis of her poetry would flesh out in greater detail the bridge that Lord is talking about. Her essays on Grenada, for example, and the extent to which this work resonates with the intellectual contributions on the issues that are explored in Lord's work. I think to look at the essays also would enhance that. And I'll stop there and turn it back over to the moderator.
Now, I feel like we could probably go all day on this panel, but we have about 20 minutes for questions, so I'd love to open it to the floor. Okay, starting with you.
Hello again, I'm Erin Chapman. I have a question for Kabria. I'm interested to know a greater context for. Oh, okay. I'm interested to know a greater context for Garnett Barbossa's work and her sense of what was important, her intellectual and activist priorities, these kinds of things. I'm interested in particular in. I was thinking of Anna Julia Cooper. I was also thinking of Michelle Mitchell's work, Righteous Propagation. I'm a U.S. historian, and so I'm limited in that way, and I know that your paper doesn't intend to be. So, but it's just a greater sense of context for who she was in conversation with and her thoughts.
Sure. I'm also a U.S. historian, so my dissertation project is on African American women's education during the 19th century, roughly antebellum era, 1820 to 1865. And so I actually came to her studying her mother, Julia Williams, who was one of the students at Prudence Crandall School in Connecticut. So she established, Prudence Crandall was a white Quaker woman. She established a school for young African American women, the first of its kind in New England in 1833. And the school was, there was a lot of opposition to the school, and it eventually closed, a lot of violence. And so her mother attended that school. And then I started following her mother, and then I found out she married Henry Highland Garnett, and I thought that was quite fascinating. And then I found they had children, and so Mary Highland Garnett was the product of the offspring of those two abolitionists. And so I came to this paper then as a U.S. historian, and so a lot of my sources are very U.S. based. And one of the things I do want to do eventually as a work in progress is I want to eventually go to Liberia, look at some of the records there to see if I can find more about her writings and her lectures. So all I have now are times when she comes to the U.S., goes and comes to Britain, but I don't have anything that's sort of produced in Liberia. In terms of her contemporaries, I think she's actually really in conversation with people like Blyden. And she's really Biden is the president of Liberia College at this time, and he's really focused on creating educated Liberian men, and she's finding that to be problematic because women are left out. So Liberia College is only open to men. And I think it changes after that, but she's really trying to emphasize the education of Native Liberian women. And so I think that's her context, and to her relationship with T. Thomas Fortune. So she's still trying to be in tune to the U.S. context, and I think that is actually problematic to some extent too. In some of the quotes that I provided about her statements on civilization and civilizing the natives, she definitely goes to Liberia as a missionary worker. I think she leaves or she passes is not a missionary worker. She actually distances herself from the Ladies' Board of Home Missions and tries to kind of do something different, but she still has a sort of Western mindset, and that comes across in a lot of her writings. I don't know about links to Anna Julia Cooper and other sort of late 19th century African American intellectuals, but women intellectuals, but I'll look into that. That's great.
Thanks. Any more questions? Yeah. And please introduce yourself before you ask your question.
I'm Millington Bergson-Lockwood. I had a question for Professor Gill, but maybe it's related to multiple, which is about the importance of networks abroad in terms of establishing these ideas. And I'm thinking about, even as you start a travel agency in the United States, in order to have an organized tour, you're dependent on a foreign community. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, and even some of the other commenters to talk about what is the local community that these African American women are tapping into that, and in some ways they're dependent on.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, absolutely. When it came to establishing tour groups in Europe, that is part of a much longer tradition where American tourists were going over. And so the Henderson Agency replicated in many ways many of the travel agencies that were targeting white travelers at that time. But because her agency was the first one to really promote travel to West Africa, she really had to build an entire infrastructure. And so because she was in Atlanta and was very familiar with the Kings, and the Kings knew that she started this travel agency, they approached her to handle the travel itinerary for that Ghanaian independence celebration. And she had, this was completely uncharted territory. Certainly Europeans and primarily white Americans had been traveling to East Africa, mainly on safari, and in terms of advertising, I came across these great parallel advertisements much later in the 1970s, but for white tourists, they promoted Africa, and all the travel brochures only had animals in them, right? So there was this huge picture, safari, which had been a very long tradition. For the ones that the Henderson Travel Agency worked with, and mind you, they had to work with the white travel agents and the black travel agents had to work through the same airline companies, but they would promote, Pan Am would have two different brochures. The ones for the African American, for the Henderson Travel Agency, always had pictures of people, would talk about this kind of enlightened African civilization, meeting people, engaging with people, talking to people. So when it came to, and I'm going to hopefully get a trip over to Ghana to get a little bit better sense of the on-the-ground work that was going on there, but that was their biggest challenge, is that they didn't know there were no sort of established bus companies to take these folks around. So she became very creative and, hired taxi drivers and got them equipped with buses, and essentially, before she died, was named by the African Tourist Agency as the person who had the greatest influence in establishing tours to West Africa. So she essentially built the infrastructure. The details of it are what I'm still researching, but you're absolutely right. She had to build from the ground up this transnational infrastructure, and in the process got to meet and engage with lots of people around the world.
Did other panelists want to elaborate on their sense of the local context?
So for the networks, I think, as we all mentioned, it's the blood dimension, which is, I would say, a parameter, an essential parameter, and it created a natural bond, and so they were pushed to advance common issues. For example, if I took the example of African American women and African women in Nairobi, they talked about their reproductive limited access. In South Africa, women were also sterilized because they had to work, and so with the African sisters, this natural bond necessarily pushed them to argue some new concepts. The same for the resolution based on race. For example, I think it was Vivian Lowery Derrick who said we had spontaneous affinities which pushed us to work together. So that I would say it this way.
Did you?
Yeah. I would just add that for Mary Helen Garnett Barbosa, it was actually really quite difficult for her to set up her school. So she faced financial difficulties, but she did have the support of the local community. And there were young Liberian women who wanted to attend her school, and women in general who wanted to attend her school. But that infrastructure she had to build from the ground up. So that meant part of her fundraising, going to Britain and coming back to the U.S., was telling people, please give me some money so I can, put a roof over this school, because they were often out in the open. And missionary work, I think, in general, was very difficult in West Africa. And I think Betty, colleague Thomas, has done a lot of great work on talking about the difficulties of missionary work in West Africa, the different the life, diseases. Her son dies in West Africa while she's doing this missionary work. Her father dies in West Africa. Henry Highland Garnett, she had contacts through him, obviously, and she had support from the Liberian government, but it was still very, very difficult work for her to be in West Africa.
I realize I was a bit remiss as moderator. I didn't actually give the panelists space to respond to Alexandra's comments. I feel like I don't know if we can have a little extra time. We may be cutting into lunchtime, but I would love for you all to be able to comment on what Alex provided as some great kind of stimulation for you to think about how to work these ideas out further, and then throw it back out to the audience. So,
Okay.
if you guys wanted to start. Yeah.
So what I meant with luxury items, yes, maybe for the childcare, I wasn't clear enough. I was meaning childcare centers. So for example, for middle white class women, okay, they had a job. All they wanted is to have a job with more responsibility, decision makings. Whereas for an Afro-American woman, she was just fighting to have a decent job, just a job where she could earn enough money to feed her child every day. So that was what they phrased as luxury items.
I answered part of it about kind of the different marketing toward white patrons, but it's really very rich because once Henderson becomes very astute and showing that there is indeed a market for Black international travelers, then she gets the attention of the big major airline companies. And there's this wonderful TWA ad that I came across where they would market Black travelers and say, you know, come over to Europe, and this is sort of the transnational dynamics, come to Europe and engage with African students here, which was this really kind of just saying that go to Europe to learn the Watutsi from African students, and you can teach them the hustle or whatever, you know, like they had this kind of but this was marketed toward Europe was really interesting to me, whereas all of those things were sort of, you know, certainly devoid in the literature, and that the things that were marketed toward whites, which again, when it came to Africa, was completely sort of safari kind of animal driven, where for Black tourists, even the major companies realized that the kind of interpersonal relationships were going to be really important for African American travelers. To be able to engage with people from the African continent as well as the diaspora was crucially important. But I haven't come across any poodles versus police dogs, but I will be on the search for that one. That would be a great source if I could.
So thank you for asking about Grenada, because what actually brought me to really thinking about these relationships is Audre Lorde's Grenada, an Interim Report, which is an essay that she writes. Audre Lorde's parents migrated from Grenada to New York City before she was born, and she has this, it's a great essay and I recommend everyone read it. She stopped the presses on Sister Outsider in order to include it, so it was clearly very important for her to say something about the U.S. invasion of Grenada, but also to do some work to trouble the idea that because she might be considered a member of the Grenadian diaspora, that she didn't have to think critically about her role as a Black feminist in the United States, which was on the oppressing side, right, of the situation. So the terminology that she uses that was so attractive to me is around relativity. So she says, you know, for people in Grenada, the United States is just a place where some dear relative may live. And she understands herself as a near relative. So when she's talking about how she wants to mobilize African American solidarity with Grenada, she's saying, this is not because I know what Grenada needs, or that because I should have some kind of sovereignty in Grenada over what their self-determination looks like. This is because I'm a Black person who lives in the United States, and the United States exports racism. And so she makes that connection on those terms, again, in the terms that she uses to talk about South Africa, on the terms of blood spilled and on the terms of Black expendability being a shared experience, as opposed to something that naturally says, well, she grew up eating something cooked by somebody from Grenada, and therefore, you know, she has some kind of privileged role in the politics of that space. And I think that that's incredibly useful. It's useful to me in terms of relating to my own desires. I talk about my own desires in public so much, but that's because I'm a student of Audre Lorde, and so my own desires to be connected, right? Like wanting to be connected, to be in sisterhood, to be in relationship, but also understanding that it's operating through an unequal power dynamic, and it is not helpful to be uncritical of our privilege and our situation within empire. It's not helpful to anyone. And so there's something about, I'm so interested in Fatma's presentation, because I know you didn't speak this quote, but you had the quote on your PowerPoint of the blood that binds us is greater than the water that separates us.
It's
and
a
of course,
powerful message.
yeah, the blood and the water. And I'm really interested also, and then you just mentioned the spontaneous affinity, right? And I'm interested also as a poet and thinking about, like, what do these terms actually mean? You know, like, what is the blood that binds us? Alexis DeVille asks all these helpful questions about how what binds us propels us, it compels us. And so I think that it doesn't necessarily allow us to fall back on something that is natural or simple or easy, or make sameness where there are also important differences. And so there's something about that spontaneous affinity. I love the word spontaneous there, because it really centralizes that moment of encounter, right? And I'm interested in those moments of encounter in my own life, and also, you know, in the work that we look at and the work that I look at, because there's so much going on there, right? These narratives, and then how it gets translated into the word choice that's so repetitive and so familiar around blood, around water, right? Like, what are these things? How are these things actually circulating in the bodies that we make for each other, in the relationships that we make, and what is the violence that happens in those encounters when we don't understand accountability that's informed by strategic relationships to difference.
I would just re-echo too Mabula's comment from yesterday about the question about whether or not diaspora has a center, and what the you know, sort of the conundrum of thinking about diaspora is in these moments where there are exhortations to blood, but yet the affinity still has to be constructed. It has to be practiced. And I think that's true for all of the cases that we're looking at here. So it's definitely worth it to think about, you know, to use Brett Edwards' phrase, the practice of diaspora, as one that's, you know, definitely something that doesn't come naturally. So, yes.
I wanted maybe to add something about this spontaneous alliance. For example, if I take Resolution 31, I mean, it was just unthinkable, you know, to present such a resolution, because at that time, for the U.S., it was impossible to discuss any issue on racism. And these women, because they were brought to work together, I mean, they were strong enough just to overcome all the differences. All the other feminist movements couldn't, you know, overcome the political divisiveness, whereas they could. They said, okay, we are not going to look at political issues, we are just going to look at our everyday life and see how we can change the world, how can we have a better world for everybody, for all the women of color.
Well, really, the everyday then became the political. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll keep this short. The Garnett Memorial School was an industrial school. I also find it kind of interesting, and thank you for your comments. I also find it kind of interesting that there would be education around the household and domestic work. Some of it was, you know, just subjects like knitting, sewing, and there was also like just more formal subjects as well, so literacy, history, Liberian history, and all of that. So, and it's also kind of difficult to trace precisely what a classroom, you know, a day in the life of, you know, young Liberian woman in Mary Highland Garnett Barbosa's classroom. So those records I haven't been able to find just yet. And I do agree that there's this complicated relationship between Liberians, or Americo-Liberians, and Native Liberians, particularly around religion. So not all young Liberian women and young Liberian girls and women were easily converted, according to Mary Highland Garnett Barbosa. And because there was a Muslim population, a lot of them actually resisted it. But they had these sort of educational spaces, I think, are spaces where these conflicts were kind of played out. So I think there's much more work that I'd like to do around African Americans and Liberians, and this whole idea of civilization and the civilizing mission.
So the audience, Laurel in the back, then Farah, and then Imani in the back. So if we could maybe take all three and then just, kind of put those out too, and let them, answer.
Thank you again, Laurel Semley. And I just wanted to thank you for all of your papers. I really appreciate the way in which you all have incorporated Africa into your papers in different ways, and especially I'm struck by the ways in which Africa is engaged intellectually, in the ways in which you're talking about Africa and Africans are engaged intellectually in each of your papers in interesting ways. And I think that's interesting because often, I think in the present, and one could agree or disagree with this, Africa is engaged experientially. You go to Africa to experience, you discover yourself, and this is how it's marketed in a lot of ways. And I'm wondering if you think that is something that is new, or if, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to ask if you think that it is, that people still in this sort of African American and transnational feminist way, if people are continuing to engage with Africa in this intellectual realm, or if it's something that's lost because of the sort of ways in which Africa is now depicted as a space where one experiences it, where one sort of travels, and this would be something that whether African American or white tourists or any kind of tourist would sort of experience Africa. If it's something that's ongoing, if it's something that's lost, that intellectual connection is lost, or if it's that intellectual connection comes out of a specific time where the ways in which civil rights activism and African American women's activism has always been transnational and international in its outlook. And there's a realization of that, an acknowledgement of that. And if that is something that people still recognize and therefore that intellectual connection is ongoing, or if that's been lost, if we've lost that recognition of the inherent internationalist vision in civil rights and feminism.
Thank you for wonderful papers. I'm Farrah Griffin, and I'll just make my comments, not questions, so you don't have to worry about answering them. One, Professor Gill, until your paper, I hadn't thought about this. I thought of Sylvia Arden Boone, who was a professor at Yale. Before she became the first black woman tenured professor at Yale, she wrote what is widely considered the first travel book, it's not kind of non-racist, Pan-Africanist travel book to Africa called West African Travels. And I'm thinking that the women you're talking about actually are sort of her predecessors, but we don't think of it because we don't look at the places where they were writing and publishing, and that they're all engaged in a kind of similar project at different times. So I just thank you for opening my eyes to that. And Alexis, I think there was so much that was rich about your paper, but I'm especially struck by the role of editors as intellectuals and who create, and Cheryl Green is a good friend. And yes, there was a day when Essence was as you described it, that create space for all of these possibilities, but they don't, and Toni Morrison is editor at Random House, that they create space for these voices to emerge, but they also have a vision of what it is they're trying to put out there, and that we need to think about their work as intellectual work as well. So thank you for mentioning Cheryl and for showing how important Alexis was there as well. Thank you.
My name is Imani Uzuri, vocalist, composer, cultural worker. I'm happy, getting out of the camera's way. I'm happy to be here. I'm so happy I got to ask these questions. Thank you all so much for your work. It was really great. I didn't know about some of these women or some of these situations at all, so that was great. I forgot your name, you were dealing with, yes.
Kabria.
I really would love to hear more, maybe you addressed it in your response, I think, somewhat. I want to hear more about, in more maybe radicalized kind of deconstructing or critique of Ms. Garnett Barbosa, because to me, if it had been a white woman who you were talking about, I would have been offended and devastated by this kind of presentation of her kind of very colonized, diminishing the way she talked about the natives.
Right.
And I understand that wasn't all that she was, but I definitely feel like it would diminish my kind of trauma. Or if I would read the paper, I go, okay, well, she's been contextualized, I'll move on and focus on the stuff that was actually really good. And I would love to know if there's any responses from, is there any documentation? I know you haven't been to the library, but is there any kind of responses? Was there any other type of movement aside long, maybe resistance to the Liberian colonization, as it was called, or some of these, were there some young women who are already, pretty much the women who were there already, Native women, were they doing types of work where they were actually seen as kind of like this, they're kind of imposing this kind of colonized Christian mentality, like some of the white missionaries were known to have done in Africa. So that's for you. And for Miss Alexis, I just want to say thank you for that paper, because I'm an intellectual and an artist, and I really, I might get emotional, but I really loved. I love the way you honored those traditions from Black women. So, okay, thank you. For the travel woman, that's a little stuff I wanted to just find out. Do you feel that Miss Ford is, what's her name?
Henderson?
Henderson, who I had never heard of. I mean, even me as a person, when I went to Senegal, I definitely had all these visions of what Africa was, this kind of mythology. That was do you feel like that those tours, since they were the first tours of West Africa, do you feel like they kind of helped create this mythology of African Americans longing to find a way to connect physically with the continent, and on some level created a true mythology in the sense it wasn't necessarily connected to what was real about Africa, this kind of imagined home space that someone talked about. And then the last thing I'll say to you is Greg Tate wanted to know, to Alexis, do you think there's something like an Essence now, except for people walking around Brooklyn or maybe Philadelphia? Do you feel like there's spaces that are happening like that? Thank you all.
Thank you for your questions, Imani. I agree, Mary Helen Garnett Barbosa is a complex woman to study, precisely because she advances these ideas about natives that if it were a white female missionary worker, you might expect that this would be racist. I'm hesitant to. I think she's a complex person, and because of her upbringing, having been the daughter of Henry Helen Garnett, who was one of, I would call him the first Pan-Africanist, who was really about establishing ties to Africa. And then eventually was elected as a consulate U.S. consulate to Liberia. I'm hesitant. I'm trying to figure out how to read her and how to interpret her. I do want to critique her ideas about civilization, definitely, and what she says about the natives. At the same time, she's talking about this in American and British newspapers, and her purpose is really money here. She wants to fundraise. And so I'm interested in the ways in which maybe this might be sort of a strategy of hers. It's a double-edged sword, but is it a strategy that she's trying to get people from Britain and people from the U.S. here in New York City and Philadelphia? She gives lectures down in the South as well at this time, trying to fundraise for her school. I do think there are responses from young Liberian women about her school. I just haven't really been able to come across those. But as I mentioned earlier, there was resistance to her trying to convert and Christianize these women. And so it seems that maybe around 1887, 88, when she was doing some of her traveling, she moved away from missionary work and is seen more as an educator. But Fortune didn't criticize her in New York Freeman, the Christian Advocate. All these newspapers, these publications did not really criticize her. Black newspapers didn't criticize her. The London-based newspaper, they clearly had their own ideas about the dark continent anyway. So she gave this interview and they still use that term, even though she said that's not the appropriate term to be using. So I think she's a complex person to study, and part of what I want to do in this paper is kind of tease that out a little bit. But I think those are great questions.
There was a great question about the extent to which Henderson was involved in creating this kind of mythology of Africa. Where I really got excited about these earlier trips, these sort of I call them the pre-Roots trips, right? Because I really think Roots, I think in terms of the mythology, there you are, that a lot of it came around that, because what I found, and even in the scholarship, in terms of trips to Africa, it's all this based on kind of the heritage tourism with slave castles where Africa's sort of frozen in this kind of slave trade past. But what I found of those early trips from the, the late 1950s until about the Roots miniseries is that it was more about kind of dispelling the myths of the dark continent type things, the things that Henderson would talk about in her press coverage, that there seemed to be, because they did not have the infrastructure of the slave castles and slave forts as tourist sites yet, that there was a much more expansive engagement with West African societies, with African peoples, instead of just going to sort of reclaim one's African past. Did she benefit and manipulate it once that became kind of the heritage tourism thing? Absolutely. But what I sort of look at, and an article that I'm finishing up is looking at the travel during the kind of era of the early decolonization movements, and that really what they were going to do was not to find this mythic African past, but was to connect and say, wow, look at this model of decolonization. Look at how empowering it is to see Black peoples, take control of their destinies in this way. And so that seemed to be more of the narrative until the kind of Alex Haley Roots type thing, and then it became all about reclaiming this mythic African past. And Henderson did a wonderful job of capitalizing on that, because of all things that she is also a businesswoman. And so I'm also situating her within a kind of entrepreneurial tradition as well. And so just as some of the earlier panels were talking about the complexities of the women we study, sort of, not to forget that she's trying to make money. And so once she sees that that's a way of making money, it becomes that. But in the earlier period, I think there was something much more complex going on. But thank you for your question.
Any other responses?
Oh, so to the about is there something going on today that is playing a role that Essence played then? I wish. There definitely is work going on. I mean, the Coup magazine would be one of my favorite examples, even though it's not particularly active right now. There's definitely work that's going on that is amazing Black transnationalist feminist work that's happening, especially online. But in terms of something like Essence that is in the beauty shop, that is in so many homes, I don't think that there's something that has that level of access. And so I think that the really brilliant thing, and definitely affirming what Ferris said about what Cheryl Green and Alexis DeVoe especially, but in collaboration with other editors there, decided to do is huge. Alexis DeVoe always talked about Essence magazine as a fashion magazine. Like she didn't have these ideas that it was some kind of like political journal, but she related to it in the way she wanted to relate to it, because she understood that meant that it was circulating in a way that maybe some of the other things that even she herself wrote, like her more experimental work, would never circulate because it was Essence magazine. And so I think that there one example that I want to highlight that makes me really happy and hopeful is that there is a sister comrade, Aisha Pico, some people might read her stuff online who are in this room, but she does something called Sister Witness Saturdays in Philadelphia, where she literally stands on a corner and like competes with Jehovah's Witnesses and hands out texts. So Transformation of Silence into Action and Power is the text for this Saturday, which she informed me of on my Facebook page, which made me thrilled, right? So there's definitely still an impulse, and there's definitely still work going on online and on the ground and through public libraries and through every, I think, means that especially I see young Black feminists in my generation taking on. There's still that desire and accountability there, but I don't think there's anything on a level that has the distribution and presence in the homes of African American women that is talking about transnational politics in a radical way.
Well, I'm sorry, I have to cut it off now because we're already cutting into lunch, but I want to give a round of applause again to our really wonderful panelists. And I just want to say, make a quick announcement. If the panelists for the next session could please hand over a brief bio to Sean Mendoza at the back door. And other than that, we'll see you back here at 2 for the next panel. Thank you.